say record. Yeah, and that way, if anybody misses it, they can listen later. So I just got back from a trip out west to see my son in the Sierras, and that was wonderful. It was a very nice break from everything here. I can't say it was any cooler out there. It's like about 102 on a normal day, and it would there's been some massive fires there last year. Something called the Creek Fire that basically, I mean, there's no green left in a lot of parts of this of the western slope of the Sierras, but other areas are recovering. So the son's doing working as a wildlife biologist out there right now, and was able to show me a whole bunch of places. So I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So it's fun when your kids grow up and they go to neat places. So something to look forward to. So, so yeah, yes, really looking forward to seeing you all on Sunday. And we're, as normal, we've got a whole lineup of items to discussion. When are you all meeting with Leontini? What day is that?
Monday. It's
That is that in the
late
afternoon, during
afternoon.
the day,
It's late afternoon after the house tour.
late afternoon, and that's going to be over Zoom.
No, she's coming to Lewis Hall.
Oh, Leontini's coming to Lewis Hall. That's awesome. Good deal. Good deal. Yeah, I gotta call Leontini and catch up with her. So, um, but yeah, so we've got between the tours that we have that talk about the sites at Montpelier and how that blends in with the community work, work we're doing with the descendant community. That it'll be a really nice perspective on how all this is comes together for research, but then comes together for what we worked on with structural parity, and that's something that is still being worked on, and we'll talk more about that. It's constantly evolving, and there's yeah. So but for tonight, what I wanted to do was to give you all what's called the Power of Place lecture, which is the lecture where really it's the background on the history of Montpelier. So you all probably have had a chance to look over the readings, such as the archaeology booklet. Did you all get that? And then there's some of the story maps, like with the Eastwoods and the home farm. Okay, great, great. So you've been able to go through those. And what we're going to talk about tonight is how all those sites relate to what you all are going to be working on, which is not the blacksmith shop, but the farrier shop. We actually just discovered that this week that it definitely is a farrier shop. We've been calling it a farrier shop over the summer because we just had a sense it was, and we found some artifacts this past week that really show that it is, and we're super excited about the horseshoe nail tips, which doesn't sound very exciting, but it shows what was happening, the activity that was happening there. And before I started, just wanted to see if any of you all had any questions about what to expect for the week, what to bring. You all got the document for what to bring. I don't know what the temperature is going to be next week, but this week it has been an absolute scorcher. Sorry. We've been actually switching a lot of the tours to the afternoon, so y'all are going to be really glad to have the lectures in air conditioning in the afternoon, because getting out to the site at 8, it just lends itself to having it be a little bit working when the weather's cool, when the time of day when it's cool. So, so yeah, does anybody have any questions about the materials or anything? And it looks like we've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Looks like there's a couple of people that are missing, but like I said, I'm going to record this, and folks will be able to catch up. But with the Power of Place, that's something that the trust refers to with a lot of their properties, and it's something that is not there's not one definition for it, what power replace is. And when you think about power replace with a historic site, you know, first, how many of y'all been to Montpelier? You could raise your hand or do the little hand up. Um, has anyone been to Montpelier? Okay, first time. Well, that's awesome. That's the whole point of this. So that's great, and it's going to be exciting to see, you know, what your all's reaction to it is, and then, you know, thinking about some of the questions that we're asking tonight, and then also through the week, is how you react to these by, you know, the end of the week. So, what do you all think of with when you think of power replace for a site like Montpelier, or how many of y'all have been to Monticello? You could raise your hand. Yeah, so a couple of y'all have. How many of y'all have been to a plantation site in general, like in the deep south, or anyone visited those? So cool. Well, when you think of power replace in historic sites, what comes to mind? What, you know, what does that bring to mind? Like I said, there's no one answer, and I always love hearing people's answers. There's Claire, you're looking very thoughtful. You're strumming your fingers and
I'm
what?
just trying to get like thoughts together. I don't know. It's very interesting because like I especially like thinking about how like going to new places that we haven't been before, especially
Mhm,
and somewhere like Montpelier where we are like so focused on like, you know, especially like our anti-racist learning and everything, and how like I think that being in a location does really change things, especially after the year we've had where everything we've done, we've just had to be able to learn what we can through our computers. So I think
mhm,
a lot of like being in the location and actually getting to work with like materials and like seeing with our own eyes, like um, just like the landscape, the architecture, like all
mhm.
of it, I think that's gonna almost hold more some, and it's gonna give more of an impact than sometimes like, because obviously readings and words can hold a lot, like, you know, like
Mhm.
words are powerful, but I think also especially like once you like see it and kind of stand there sometimes, and depending on the person, it can have like a lot more of an impact for you seeing like, oh, this is what I've been reading about, like it all kind of pulls that picture together.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the classic definition of power replace, is, you know, being able to stand at that spot and experience the you know the sights, the smells, the terrain, all of that. Um uh and Emma, you had a kind of the juxtaposition of so much virtual
Yeah.
with an upcoming experience. Is that, yeah, that is
Yeah, just
great.
Claire's
Yeah.
point about after this year of being online, I haven't thought of it that way, so that's
Mhm.
making me reflect even more.
And what about power replace? How can power replace be different depending on your background? Say, you know, a Black American visiting a plantation versus a white American. How does power replace, you know, how does power, how power would power replace might be different in that, with that context? I'm going to call on you next, Hannah.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm using my hotspot right now, so I just was making sure you could hear me. Well, I was actually like kind of thinking somewhat about something similar to what Claire was saying, mostly because when you were talking about how hot it's been, like
Hmm.
that's something that I don't know how to like word what I'm thinking, but I guess just like it kind of it brings like a seriousness to it almost, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm.
Like knowing how hot it is and how you're saying like we get to do things inside and stuff, like that's not how it was when slavery was still around. Like I just feel like that's something I've always thought about because I've been to Monticello before, and like I remember thinking that at one point, just I don't know, like how difficult that makes it.
Hmm.
um and it's kind of what you were saying about like a white person versus a black person going.
Hmm.
um I feel like it almost kind of brings you back in time a little bit, and it makes like me personally, I think about where I would be if I lived 200 years ago. What would I be doing? And I think that's a very like humbling question to ask. yourself, especially in the South. It's just kind of hard to answer also, but
Mhm.
that's just kind of what came into my mind when you asked that question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Hannah. That's wonderful. And definitely, thinking about where you would be, like in terms of the context of a plantation, if you were there 200 years ago, and what the difference would be if you're a Black person versus a white person. I mean, for a lot, many Black Americans, going to a plantation is not a beautiful experience. It's not a place where they would want to get married. It's a horrific sight. It's a sight of pain. And this is something that there are some descendants who have come on digs with us, and they have refused to go in the house, not because they're mad about the house. It is just a space of discomfort. And so that's like, you think of power of place, like you were talking about, Claire, of being able to experience it and take it all in. There's also the power of place of how that sits on your psyche, and how you react to it as your place in society. So yeah, it's and this is true of the present as it is of the past, like you were referencing, Hannah. For an enslaved American, the main house would mean something very different than, say, a visitor like the Marquis de Lafayette in 1825, when he and his entourage visited Montpelier. There would be a welcoming place for the enslaved American. That would be a place of oppression, be a place where decisions were made about selling their family members, and a place of, a lot of distress. So yeah, so this is something that, when we excavate the sites, the site you're going to be working on this week is a site of labor. And this is what we're going to talk about next, is, how we discover these sites of labor and what they mean. Is these spaces would have had meaning for the people that were there and created the sites. I mean, the artifacts you're finding were created by the enslaved Americans who lived and worked there. They were dropped there. They were intentionally hidden there. What we're after with the archaeology is not just to find the artifacts and rebuild the buildings, but really recapture the spirit of the people who lived and worked there, and understand that in a way that gives very different meaning to the space than if it was just a field. Like where you're working next week, up until last week, was just a field. And now we've got tents there. We've got excavation units that we're opening up. We started opening up the units this week with another program that we're doing. And so now that space is becoming a research site, which is bringing all this history to light, where 20 years ago, no one knew anything about this site. And so it's a different sense of power of place, in terms of, what you all are going to be doing is actually discovering, what was at this site and what people were doing there. So what I wanted to do was to go, I'll start does anybody else have any other comments or suggestions for power of place? That was a great start. Cool. Well, there's plenty of time to chime in. And what we're gonna do is, I'm gonna actually I need to share screens first. Let's get back to the Zoom meeting here. Sorry about that. I always do this. I'm gonna go ahead and share screens. And let's see, want to do screen one. And what I'm gonna do is get the PowerPoint. Yeah, and let's see, display settings, swap presenter. Yeah, so you all can see the full screen now with a map. Cool. So when you all think of, Montpelier, so many folks think of the main house. That's what so many visitors come to see when they visit Montpelier. And Montpelier, it was home to James and Dolly Madison, President Madison's home. And this is, special meaning for you all because you're at James Madison University. But also there were 300 enslaved individuals that called Montpelier home. So this illustration we've got in the bottom right-hand corner here is one of the few illustrations we have of enslaved individuals at the time. This is an enslaved mother and her child walking beside the temple. This is part of a larger painting I'll show in a few slides. But where Montpelier is in all this, where the main house is in all this, is this area shown in the white outline is the property today. And we've got about 2,650 acres, and the main house is right in the middle where the star is. And what we've been looking at for the past 20 years is, understanding the main house, getting it restored, and then also, finding the homes of those the enslaved Americans who lived and worked at Montpelier. So for a lot of the programs that we've done with Dr. Thacker and Dr. Bodel, has been doing excavations in the South Yard and around the main house, and actually finding the homes of enslaved individuals. And this is everything. Now we'll get into more details on this, not only today, but definitely next week with some of the tours we're doing. This includes everything from the South Yard, which is right beside the main house, and that we did archaeology on, and then reconstructed that recently, to the work we did on the field slave quarters, or what we thought were field slave quarters, and we've got a different idea of what these are today, especially with the sites we're finding. And then this is right below the visitor center, so you can see the visitor center up here. The mansion is just in the woods above there, and this what we've done at the field quarter where we did the archaeology is we've reconstructed that as well, so that visitors can actually see, what we found through the archaeology. And the archaeology informs this process of reconstruction. Now, for these kind of sites, what typically is found are lots and lots of artifacts, everything from ceramics to glass to animal bone to tobacco pipes. These sites are really highly visible because when people live there for 20 to 30 years, they leave massive deposits of broken items. So, and they accumulate around where the residence is. Now, the sites we're looking for for the next 5 years, though, are part of this farm complex. And they consist of, buildings where there aren't a lot of artifacts that get left behind, such as storage sheds, granaries, tobacco barns. The sites that just so happens the sites we're working on right now, the blacksmith shop and the farrier site, do have a lot of artifacts, because you can imagine at a blacksmith shop with, the production of, burning of fuels such as charcoal. There's lots of slag that gets produced, lots of iron clippings. So at the site we're working on, there is a lot, but it's still not a living site. It's a work site. And so with these work sites, also what's included in these work sites is areas where crops are processed, such as the fields, and then also where the majority of the time the enslaved individuals spent. So these are the kind of sites, usually when you visit places like Monticello and other historic sites, you don't see a lot of these sites being interpreted. They're not part of the picture of interpretation. And why do you think we'd want to interpret where the sites of labor were? What would you get out of that as a visitor? And what does it offer in terms of perspective of the enslaved individuals? And I'm gonna, Michaela, what do you think? Why would you want to interpret, sites where labor was happening and not just where the living spots are? Because when you think about people visiting, they always want to see how people lived and what their homes are like. But what about the sites of labor? What do those offer?
I feel like the sites of labor were where not only like people came together. I feel like when you go home and you live, that's very separate, but where they came together, and those are where they spent most of their days. I'd imagine they spent more time out working than they did in their own homes.
Yeah. And so often, what you get, when we study these sites of labor, what we're able to learn about is what people actually did. And in so many cases, when you think about slavery, so what the assumption is that obviously the labor is hard, but there isn't much thought put in it beyond that. And one of the things the descendant community has asked us about is, what were the intellectual lives of their ancestors? And what the discussions that came from that really pointed us towards is that we need to study the sites where their ancestors were laboring. I mean, when you think about Madison, you know, one of the key sites you'll visit next week is the library, where he literally wrote the document that became the U.S. Constitution. And you know, there's a whole tour on Madison's site of labor, you know, his mental labor, and with, you know, giving short shrift to sites where slaves are working, you're not going to be able to understand what their intellectual contributions were and how they, not only how they were able to innovate and create the plantation, because they were the ones doing the work. I mean, they were the ones that knew the land. They were the ones that knew how to blacksmith. You know, Madison wasn't teaching them how to blacksmith. A lot of these are traditions that are brought from Africa. They were learned from parents to children. And when you think about labor, you know, who are they? Who are slaves laboring for? And what might be some you know, incentives for them in their daily labor to either work hard or not, you know, try to save energy for some of their own activities. Any thoughts on that, Emma? And I'm catching you off guard, Emma, sorry. But you know, what might you learn about the labor of enslaved individuals? And I'm getting very specific in this one. It might be hard to answer this one, Emma, but what are your thoughts on this?
I I missed kind of part of it because I had to go inside, but
Okay.
I remember like in elementary school we learned a lot about um how people like came together in the fields, and that's where they started like building a lot of like African American traditions, like
Mm.
songs and like certain like stories and stuff. Like they would come together and kind of develop those traditions. So I feel like that can be really prevalent in like the labor areas rather than just the homes.
Absolutely, that's awesome, Emma, because that reminds me when we were doing surveys in the woods, you know, of areas that used to be fields, because you know you're doing a metal detector survey in the woods and you come across a tobacco barn. What does it mean about the area that was woods? That it used to be a field. And then in doing those surveys, not only did we find tobacco barns, but we also found areas where there were cook pots and there was a shed. And we realized, oh my goodness, we've got an area where in the middle of the day, slaves were assigned to cook so that the main meal would be in the midday. And so that slaves would be able to continue late into the evening with their work. And so finding those spaces where slaves are taking their meal gave a whole different perspective to what their daily lives are like and how they, you know, really built the landscape that made up that labor. So like what you're talking about with, you know, traditions that brought people together, that's one of those that would have been a site of, you know, rest and camaraderie. And, you know, we have not studied those sites yet. We just found them with the metal detector surveys, but it's something we really want to go back to and look at and to see, you know, what might come of that. So yeah, basically without studying the sites, we're not going to know what's there. And the more you study something, I mean, it's just like, you know, if you know, when you get into a hobby, you know, whether it's, you know, say it's collecting buttons, who knows, you know, all of a sudden you learn about things about buttons that you never thought about. And you begin to think about them in a different way than if you just kind of casually thought about them. So a lot of what we're getting into, why these sites are important to Montpelier, is some of what you all have mentioned. You know, one is we want to do full scale restoration, which means not just restoring the home of the of Madison, but also the enslaved homes and also all the spaces where, you know, they were working. The other thing we've got at Montpelier is almost a complete lack of documentary records on these spaces. The documents that existed at one time were burned in the 1850s after the stepson of James Madison, John Payne Todd, passed away. Madison's nieces and nephews went to his house. He had collected all the family papers. This is after Dolly sold the property in 1844, found 2 rooms full of documents that had all the plantation records where, you know, the records of where the fields were, you know, how the kind of crops that were being produced, and decided this was all too much private information that Mr. Madison, who was an incredible private man, their uncle, never would want to have out in the public, and they burned all these records. So with that, the evidence of the labor that the over 300 slaves at Montpelier performed was lost. But what we've got left, fortunately, is the archaeological record. We've got the 2,650 acres where these sites are that are incredibly well preserved, and some of the history of this gets into like just a really thumbnail sketch of the history is from the 1723 through 1844 is when you've got over 300 enslaved individuals living and working at Montpelier. And so this is when the vast majority of these sites are created that we're discovering today. After 1844, this is when Dolly Madison sells the plantation, and you go from over 100 slaves living there at one time down to about 25. So all these sites are abandoned. And then after the Civil War, there's even fewer people at Montpelier. And during the DuPont ownership, the DuPonts, like of chemical fame, like of Delaware, DuPont Chemicals, they buy Montpelier in 1901 and essentially make it into a country estate. And this is where, you get, basically the land was completely left alone, where you could have had plowing that would have disturbed all these sites. It's the DuPonts. They don't need to make money off of having their workers plow fields. They're doing more entertaining and having more kind of, private horse shows and the race tradition that's at Montpelier today. You'll learn more about that next week. But with all these sites, that what is most visible archaeologically, despite 300 years of occupation, is this first time period from the Madison period, because it's when the most number of people were living and working at Montpelier. This is when basically every inch of Montpelier is being lived on and worked agriculturally. So you just get a massive amount of sites. And so what we've been doing over the past several years is doing metal detector surveys all across these 2,700 acres. So, today the visitor core is this area circled here. That's what most people see. A few people get out to the Gilmore cabin, which we'll talk about next week, and you'll get a tour of, which is a site where former slaves of the Madisons built a home and were able to buy a farm in the post-emancipation era, the 1870s and 1880s. But for all the rest of this, back in the 1790s, what made up the Montpelier plantation was this area in yellow. This is what was actually owned by the Madison family. These other areas, what's in white is the outlines of the Madison property, or I'm sorry, the outlines of Montpelier today that's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. These areas that are outside of the yellow were part of adjacent plantations that were, to the north of Montpelier and then also to the south. And I've got a whole blog that talks about, the changing boundaries of the plantation through time, if you're interested. But what we've been doing, and we'll talk more about this, is, today there's about 1,800 acres of woods. Back in the day, there would have been about 300 acres. So most of all this would have been open fields that would have been worked. And you can see all these little yellow dots through here. These are where we found buildings from metal detector surveys. And most of these are barns that were, agricultural operations back in the day, which means, in this aerial, what is woods today was all fields back in the day. So when you look at it, we'll talk more about the metal detector survey, but the area that's in green and yellow and red, that's what we've surveyed. We've surveyed about 1/5 of the property so far, and we've got a lot more to survey, but in that we have found dozens of sites, and we'll talk more about the metal detector survey in a few minutes and how we find these sites. But for Montpelier, what I wanted to talk about next is the 3 different periods of Madison ownership at Montpelier. So there are 3 different generations of Madisons that when Montpelier was owned by the Madison family, worked and managed Montpelier in very different ways. So how many of you all know what, from school, what the major crop was during like the colonial period in Virginia? What comes to mind? Bailey, you
Tobacco.
just popped up. What do you think?
I'd assume tobacco as well.
Yeah, tobacco, absolutely. And you'll learn more about this in the tour, but the early home site was called Mount Pleasant. And this was, James Madison's grandmother is the person that ran Montpelier from the 1730s all the way up until her death in 1761. And so his grandfather in 1732 was poisoned by two of his slaves and a neighboring slave. After that, his grandmother takes over the operation of the plantation. James Madison's grandmother does. And she basically runs it as a tobacco farm all throughout up until just before the Revolutionary War in 1761, about 15 years before the Revolutionary War. And what she has her slaves doing is running it as a tobacco plantation. So what they were doing is, this was initially, clearing the land, girdling the trees, cutting the bark off the bottom a band of bark off the bottom of the trees, so it killed the trees. And then once there was sunlight that could reach the ground surface, they would hoe the soil into hills and plant tobacco. And this is a shot right here. It was done by John H.B. Latrobe in the 18-teens, or actually 1790s, showing an overseer looking over a gang of female slaves while they do hilling of tobacco. And this is after these trees have been girdled, and then after they died have been cut down. So really intensive labor. And during this time, this is when James Madison James Madison was born in 1751. So when he was born in 1751, we always assumed for a long time that he grew up at Mount Pleasant, which is about a third of a mile from where the main house is today. And you all will learn more about the position of all these when you get to Montpelier next week. But for years we thought he was at Mount Pleasant, and there were 3 generations of folks living at Montpelier or Mount Pleasant: the grandmother, James Madison's parents, and then he and his siblings. Well, what we discovered very recently is that when James Madison was first born, he was born not at Montpelier, but just east of Fredericksburg in what's called Port Conway, Virginia. And it was only a month after he was born that he and his mom moved to Montpelier. And we're thinking we recently found what's called a planter's cottage. This is what we originally thought was a kitchen right beside the main house at Montpelier. This little building right here, turns out it was built in the 1750s and was probably built before his mother, Nellie Conway Madison, arrives with James Madison as a 1-month baby boy. And we're thinking probably she insists this house be built because she probably doesn't want to live with her mother-in-law, who's basically this kind of, really this lady who is very unique at the time. She's a matriarch of the plantation. She's running it as a tobacco farm. And what this forces her oldest son to do is to start having his slaves engage in other trades, one of which is blacksmithing. James Madison Sr., James Madison Jr.'s father, James Madison Sr. right here, he begins a blacksmith operation at Montpelier in the 1750s. And what he also does is he imports goods from England and sells them to the local community. So while his mom is having her slaves grow tobacco and market it to the global economy, like to England, James Madison's parents are producing goods that they sell to the local community, to other farmers and plantation owners. And basically this makes Montpelier incredibly wealthy, not only in the colonial era, but definitely during the American Revolution. When the main house is built by 1765, after James Madison's grandmother dies in 1761, basically Montpelier is one of the wealthiest plantations in central Virginia. They are, during the American Revolution, the bottom falls out of the tobacco market. And most plantations by the 1780s in central Virginia are in debt. Montpelier is, its economy is thriving because of this blacksmith production that's going on right beside the main house. So for those of you all that have been up to the main house, you'll remember the temple was just to the north here. That's the site of where the blacksmith was during the 18th century, during the Revolutionary War. And this blacksmith shop, what we found through the limited archaeology we've done, but more from the documentary records, they're producing plows, they're producing wagons, they're producing new items that are being sold to the local community. And the fact that there's a blacksmith here allows James Madison's father, when he and Nellie Conway Madison take over the agricultural operations of the plantations, they begin plowing at Montpelier in the 1760s. And this is some of the earliest plowing in the Virginia Piedmont. And we found amazing evidence for this plowing from the LIDAR surveys. And this is talked about in that Eastwoods story map, where we found massive erosion, because you start plowing the land and you plow it with directional plowing, all of a sudden you have these erosional furrows that just wash away thousands of tons of topsoil, into these lower valleys. So during the 18th century, their work, James Madison is having the overseer and the enslaved Americans growing grains that are sold to Europe, marketing local goods to the local community, merchant goods to the local community, makes just a fantastic, massive fortune off of this plantation that allows James Madison Jr., the son, to pursue his political career. So when he's starting to serve on the Council of Safety, in Williamsburg during the American Revolution, he doesn't have to worry about what's happening on the plantation. And so for really the next 40 years of Madison's political life, he's able to pursue his political career. But when James Madison's father starts to get ill in the 1790s, this is when James Madison Jr. takes over the operation of the plantation. And this is when you go for the George and Main house that he and Dolly arranged for an addition to be added onto the house and add on the front portico. And this is when they first retire back to Montpelier in 1797. And during this time, what James Madison Jr. is interested in doing is making Montpelier into a scientific farm, where instead of just plowing randomly, the landscape, he's having his slaves plow using contour plowing and manuring of fields and looking at soil conservation. And what James Madison, in a nutshell, if you were going to summarize him as a political philosopher, he was a genius. He came up with the basis for our governmental structure with the Constitution. And the Constitution is an amazing document. It's one that not only, at the time, in many ways protected the economy, which was based on slavery, that allowed the preservation of the Union to happen, because a country is only as good as its economy. And with relying on slave labor, and we'll talk more about this when you're here, and we've got a whole exhibit that talks about this that's open now for you all to see, is what Madison does is he uses the Constitution to protect slavery. But in terms of how he utilizes slavery for agricultural production at his own plantation, if you were going to invest with somebody in terms of their business interests, it wouldn't be James Madison. He basically, by the 18 teens, drives the economy of Montpelier into the pits. And what you go is from him experimenting with scientific farming in 1790s, when he and Dolly retire in 1817, what they turn Montpelier into is a breeding plantation. Because by 1817, it's 10 years after the transatlantic slave trade has been outlawed. And y'all might remember in 1807 is when the importation of slaves from Africa is made illegal. And part of the reason for this is there's a number of slave rebellions that have been perpetuated by native-born Africans. And what planners in the US want to do is start having more Creole-born slaves born in the US who are less likely to rebel and do other things such as run away. In addition, what goes on with the Louisiana Purchase in 1801? What does the Louisiana Purchase become in the US? What crops start being grown in the deep South in the 18 teens, and especially the 30s and the 40s?
In the South, wouldn't it have been cotton? And then in the Midwest, it would have been like corn and maybe stuff like that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jacob. Exactly. Yeah. In the deep South, it was cotton. And then there, in terms of more of the free states, it was grains, where, you know, independent farmers were able to establish themselves. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Jacob. In the Deep South, it was cotton. And this was not only a incredibly nutritional draining crop, but also a labor draining crop as well. I mean, how the US was able to become a global economic power was through cotton production and exporting cotton to Europe. And the innovation that happened with cotton was the cotton gin in the 1790s. But after that, all the innovations came from maximizing the amount of cotton that could be grown and picked by slaves. And this is what's called the whipping machine of the Deep South, where slaves were, you know, basically worked to death in these cotton plantations, and where new slaves are obtained were from these old slave states like Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. So when you look at the population demographics of Montpelier, say in the 1820s, over 50% of the 120 slaves at Montpelier at that time were under the age of 10. So basically, they are intensively breeding slaves so they can, you know, sell, you know, create more slaves and then sell them. And so this is at the home of James Madison, and he even writes about this. He writes in the 1820s that he hasn't produced a single successful crop, and the crop that is being produced by where money is being made by his nieces and nephews is by selling slaves. And this is exactly what he ends up doing. So you go to essentially a breeding plantation in the in the 1820s and 30s, and this is the period that we're looking to restore to Montpelier to. So, you know, not exactly a glorious past to celebrate with a founding president. So, you know, you think about, you know, who Madison is as, you know, father of the Constitution, and what citizenship was. Who would be able to enjoy citizenship in, say, the 1820s when all this was happening? What group of people were considered citizens?
Would it be white men and those with property?
Yeah, white males and landowners. And, you know, what do you think that race card, why that race card is being played? What's the deal with having it be white people?
For
Why wouldn't
voting?
you want black people to be citizens?
I would say for voting purposes, like keeping themselves in power.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would, for the founding fathers, which is the operative word because they were males. If you're a woman at the time, you did not have the right to vote. You didn't have the right to run for office. You were not considered a citizen. But if they allowed blacks to vote, and it's in all blacks, I mean, basically the majority of people in the Deep South were black. I mean, it would have been, and further, you know, blacks were considered property. I mean, literally, when you think about protection of personal property that's written about in the Constitution, that personal property is slaves. It's not about land. I mean, colonists were able to buy land from the crown in the 1670s, the 1680s. That wasn't a new thing. But the protection of personal property is something that was a key concern in the Constitution, to make sure that slavery, you know, people as property were protected, you know, as property, not as people. So yeah, this is something we're going to get into next week in terms of, you know, the exhibits that you all are going to be seeing, how we present this to the public, how we interpret the sites that we're excavating. And for what happens to Montpelier, you know, after the 1830s, is James Madison dies in 1836. And after he dies, this is when the people that make up Montpelier, the enslaved individuals, are basically turned into cash. Dolly Madison sells the entire enslaved community by 1844. You know, starting in the 1830s, there's 10 or 15 to 20 people sold every 5 years. By 1844, everyone is gone. And when there's some accounts talking about Dolly selling slaves in family units, but when slaves are sold to Richmond and then put on the auction block and then sold to Louisiana, they're sold as individuals and going to the highest bidder. So all the, you know, this is where descendants trying to find their ancestry today of the Montpelier descendant community, it's so difficult because all these families are broken apart in the 1840s. So it's so with the sale of all the enslaved community, by 1848, when the next owner buys Montpelier, the slave population goes to down to about 25. So all the buildings you see in this picture right here, the temples up here to the north, where you all are going to be is in Lewis Hall, which is in these woods up here. And by the way, all these images, these are 3D digital reconstructions we've done working with UVA and University of Arkansas to create this 3D imagery. But this right here is the South Yard, and basically the area where most slaves are living is from the main house south towards the visitor center. But by 1848, all these buildings were taken down, and there's no evidence left of them, in terms of what you could see above ground. And so what happens to all these areas is the area, if you look at the larger map right here, what used to be the core of the Madison plantation right in here, the farm complex, all this gets shifted to the north, where the archaeology lab is today and where Lewis Hall is today. This becomes the new farm complex in the 1850s and continues there all the way into the DuPont period. And so what happens with all the land that was open at one time and being worked as fields is starting in the 1840s, it grows back into woods. And so you just have this incredible preservation of all these plantation sites, through the late 19th century. The one time period where you get site development is during the Civil War. And Chris Pash is going to be bringing you all on a tour of some of the Civil War encampments that we found. There were, during the winter of 63 and 64, after Gettysburg, but before Wilderness, there were about 1,200 Confederate troops camped at Montpelier. And not only do they include summer encampments, but also there are winter encampments that we interpret today. And really, one of the main features we interpret at these sites is the Civil War was Madison's, really his greatest fear, which was the Union being dissolved and the country being divided. I mean, the Constitution, what he struggled with for the 3 years of getting it ratified, was the way to have every single state be part of the Union. I mean, that was the whole deal with the Constitution. And what he writes about it in his deathbed in the 1830s is that, his greatest fear is the Union being divided. And so really what he and other founding fathers do is they kick the can of slavery, resolving what slavery was down the road in lieu of preserving the Union. So there's all sorts of negotiations made to preserve slavery and keep it as an institution all the way up until the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was elected. And that's when pretty much, that was when the deciding factor politically was that slavery was no longer going to be protected. And that's when the South succeeded. And so this is something, having these Civil War sites, it allows us to talk about this in a very tangible way and look at Madison's legacy, not only as a slave owner, but also as a politician, and how these two roles combine. But after the Civil War, what happens at Montpelier is it basically goes into further decline. The house, has changes made to it. But one of the major changes is there are some of the former slaves become farmers on the property, and they build new homesteads. And the Gilmore cabin is one of these, and we've restored the Gilmore cabin today to what it looked like in the 1880s during this period of Jim Crow. And so it's another aspect that we talk about with citizenship. But the real changes that happened to Montpelier are in the early 20th century, when the DuPonts buy Montpelier. And when the DuPont family buys Montpelier in 1901, they make it into this massive country estate where they take, this relatively small, 30-room main house and double it in size. So you can see this middle picture right here. You can see the back porch here. After 1902, there are all these additions added, and basically the back porch gets sucked into all these additions. So it goes from this structure to this massive structure. But what's great about this is all the what would have been outbuildings back in the day all get put into this main house. So all the space around the surrounding the main house is basically left untouched. And for the estate itself, what the DuPonts do is they continue to develop this farm that's created in the 1850s that's on the opposite side of the property where the Madison era farm complex is. And so the area that we're digging today has basically been untouched since the 1844 when Dolly sold the property. Dolly Madison sold the property, and it literally has not even been plowed, which is absolutely unheard of for these Virginia plantations, and allows us to do just some incredible restoration work. So basically during the 20th century, it's a country estate. The trust buys it it's given to the trust in 1984. And this is the period where we begin to look at restoring the house. So in 2002, to make a long story short, kind of ironically, the Mellon family, Paul Mellon dies in 2002. He gives money to Montpelier to tear off the DuPont wings. So the Mellon family paid for the removal of the DuPont wings. And so what we do is we bring the house back to the Madison era by about 2005. And in doing this, what we discover is that, we can't have an 1820s restoration on a 20th century landscape. And so we start doing investigations after we finish the archaeology in the cellars and around the perimeter of the house to make sure the restoration doesn't disturb any of the sites that are out here. And what we do is the first thing that we tackle is the front lawn. And this is where, you've got the carriage road and the front fence. And, long and the short of this is we're able to find literally the post holes where this fence was installed. And so this is looking inside one of these post holes. Anybody remember from the readings what the squared off area is that's inside one of these post holes that's dug out? What do you think that squared off post is? And I just said it, doggone it. What do you think the squared off feature is? I just said what it was. This is a silly question that allows me to drink my water. What's the squared off feature in the middle of the post hole? Like when you dig a fence post hole, what do you put in the post hole? Hannah, I see you first there. What do you think you put in a post hole?
Well, you broke up right when you gave the answer, so then I was like, well, I don't know
Oh,
what he said. I was trying to figure
So
out
you
what he
didn't hear
said. So I honestly don't even know what the answer was.
Well, it's the fence posts. So you dig a hole and then you put the fence post in. And so this is like, one of the key features that we look for at an archaeological site, because these fences divide up the landscape. They keep from animals from moving from one part of the site to the next part. And then even like sheds are sometimes post and ground. So you're excavating next week, if we find one of these, we're going to get really excited because it shows how the landscape was organized. And in the case of the front yard of the Montpelier, what we discovered with this fence is not only did the road run alongside this fence and it was outside of the fence, but what's inside the fence, and we use this archaeology to restore the house to what it looks like today. We, figured out from the archaeology where this fence and where this road was and then restored it. So we used the physical evidence, just like we did with the main house investigation, to actually restore this fence back. And again, one thing to remember is like we've got this illustration in the bottom left-hand corner. It's one of the few illustrations we have of Montpelier. But this, this has all sorts of artistic, foreshortening of perspective with the temple basically in the front yard. Temple is way over here, but you can't use this to restore a landscape. To figure out where this fence is, we got to figure out where the post holes are, in the ground. And the same with the restoration, restoring all the trim and all the other items in the room layout. We did that through physical investigations. So what we did with this early excavation is use the physical evidence of the post holes and the road to really understand what this landscape looked like and then restore the fence back to the landscape. And what we're doing with this is not only using the same concept in finding the buildings and restoring those, but also gaining an understanding of what the landscape is. In earlier programs with JMU, we did excavations at the Pine Alley and also what's called the boxwood grotto. And these are you've got the fence that runs across the front of the house, like you can see in this 1830s wood print here. And then there are these trees that direct the view towards the main house and away from the quarters for house slaves. And when you look at this space, this fence line goes all the way around this formal enclosure for the main house, which creates basically the entertainment grounds for the main house. And within this area, what we found is, the back lawn is where Dolly would have her famous barbecues. You've got the terraced garden that today is the ornamental garden, which is the kitchen garden of the day. And then right in the middle of this, what you've got is the south yard, which is the quarters for house slaves. And so this space is one where you've got these really almost ornamental buildings compared to the log structures that make up the rest of the buildings on the plantation that were indicated on one of the few maps we've got, which is this 1837 insurance plat that led us to do excavations in the south yard to rediscover this space. And Terry Brock is going to be giving you all a tour of the south yard on Tuesday. And so he'll go into depth about what we figured out about with the south yard. But basically, we figured out enough from the archaeology of this space to actually be able to restore the buildings. And an outcome of this restoration of this space was that not only were we able to find all these buildings and restore them, but also do this work in combination with the descendant community beginning in 2015, and really have intense discussions about how to interpret the enslaved lives at Montpelier, with the descendants themselves. And this is where the whole concept for the exhibit, The Mere Distinction of Color, came from, that you all are going to be visiting on I think that's going to be that's going to be on Tuesday morning. You all are going to see the exhibit. And this is where, the whole concept of telling this hard history of slavery and looking at the intersection between slavery, the Constitution, and race, and how the Constitution really, while in some ways it left out the enslaved Americans, but it in many ways defined who enslaved Americans were as part of this larger economy. But at the same time, this document is one that later on, after the Civil War, there's the amendment system that leads to the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments that end slavery, but then you've got Jim Crow. So it's this really complex document that, is one that you can only understand through understanding all Americans' experience in relationship to it. And this is what the descendants really put us towards with this. And in doing this exhibit in the South Yard, one thing that they asked us to really look at hard after restoring the South Yard is where the rest of, where the majority of their ancestors were working, which wasn't in the main house, but was in further afield out in, the fields and the farm complex. And so when we built the visitor center back in 2003, we had done survey where we had discovered there are just all these sites out here, and we decided, to basically shoehorn in all the parking lots in the visitor center into an area that had already been disturbed by the DuPonts in the early 20th century, and allowed this area to be preserved for future excavation. And more recently, what we've done is we've done metal detector survey that have allowed us to find all these sites out in this field. So this, again, this is the visitor center. The mansion is up here in the woods right here. And with the surveys we've done, a lot of these sites are domestic sites where what's marked in blue are sites that show up pretty easily through standard archaeological practices of what's called shovel test pits, where you dig holes in the ground every 10 feet and you can find, large concentrations of artifacts. And that's what's characteristic of these living spots. And then also the blacksmith shop. But the areas that are in red, these are areas where we found these only through metal detector surveys. And the metal detector surveys, just really briefly, what these are, and we've got about just 10 minutes left in this. So, but with the metal detector surveys, we've been doing these all across the property. And what we do with the metal detector surveys, the phase one of these metal detector surveys is to lay out a grid on a 20-meter grid, which is about 66 feet, which is square, which is about a tenth of an acre in size. And with the metal detector, you sweep each of these grids that are out on the landscape, and then do an artifact count of what's there, but then also sample the artifacts to make sure you know what period of artifacts you're dealing with. And with all the buildings that are out there, what do you think the most common artifact is that we find in doing these metal detector surveys? Emma, you're up on the screen. I can see you right now. What do you think the most common artifact is? Like for a building, when it decays in the ground, what would be left that would be metal that you could find with a metal detector?
Maybe like nails.
What'd you say, Emma?
Nails.
Yeah, nails. Absolutely. Nails are what metal detectorists called Montpelier gold. I mean, a lot of metal detectorists come to Montpelier and they expect they're going to spend the weeks, finding coins or buttons or buckles. And when we tell them what they're going to be doing is finding 95% of what they're going to be finding is nails, they kind of groan until we talk to them about what nails are. And what nails, not only is every single site during the historic period, it's built with nails, and by finding the nails, you know where the building is, but also you can date the site based on the manufacturing type of the nails. And so just really briefly, Mary's going to go into more detail on this. Every single change in the economy at Montpelier, going from the parents plowing technique to James Madison Jr. taking over the plantation, to the retirement years, to the post-Madison era, is marked by a different nail type. And so not only can you use these nails to find the sites, but you can also figure out what time period they came from. And then once you locate these sites, what we're able to do is to be able to build a picture of what was there. So if these shots right here, this is a squared off area where the main visitor core area is, zooming into where the area we're working right now, the main house is, right up here. Here's the visitor center. This is the farm complex that we're working on right now on the 60-meter interval or 60-foot interval survey. And within this area, you can see on these 20-meter grids, the area that's in red is where you've got massive concentration of nails. These are where these sites are located. And with the 20-meter grid, not only were we able to find these sites, but then date them based on the kind of nails that were found there. Once we find these sites, what we do is we go from a 20-meter grid down to a 10-foot grid. And this allows us to lay out this area in even a higher resolution and go from just finding the sites to actually figuring out where the buildings are. So areas where you've got these yellow and red concentrations, this is where the buildings actually sit. So for example, the tobacco barn up here, when we did the 20-meter survey a number of years ago, we found this area right here with a higher concentration of nails, and what also turns out to be not just nails, but also threshing machine parts. And when we went in and did excavations, what we were able to do is we were able to figure out not only were these threshing parts part of a threshing machine for threshing wheat, but they also marked where the building was. And when we opened up units where this concentration is, so this is a view of this area here, looking up towards the visitor center. This is where all these iron objects were we found from the metal detector survey. We started finding all these squared off areas that were burned trenches. And when we got to the end of the excavation, we realized we had what was originally a tobacco barn with interior burn trenches for smoking the tobacco. And then later on, this building was changed over to a wheat threshing barn when they switched from tobacco to grain cultivation. And then, so with this, what we're able to do is figure out what this building looked like. And with this building located, we're able to figure out that this was a fairly intensive area. I mean, this is where the main heart of the farm operation was. And so what we've done since then is, not only do the 20-meter survey of the entire area to find all these sites, but begin to do more of these metal detector surveys that have allowed us to really understand what this space looks like. So this is, this shot right here is a shot of the present day Montpelier with the visitor center up here. and these sites located with the field slave quarters in this area. And this is a view of, same bird's eye view looking from the same direction of what this area would have looked like in the 1820s. And for the area we're working on right now, that's all the way down in the lower corner, the farrier shop. I've got, let me see, I've got a map showing, yeah, this one right here. This shows this area with the current metal detector survey. So you can see, for example, here's the visitor center right here. The main house is right over here. For Aaron and Emma, we excavated the overseer's house last year right up in this area. So this area right up in here where this massive red concentration is from the metal detector survey, this is all these little squares where we opened up 5 foot by 5 foot excavation units to actually reveal, the features and the artifact concentrations that we found from the metal detector surveys. The blacksmith shop that we just finished up with the field school, the JMU field school, this is this area with units that we opened up. And then where we're headed right now is down to this site where in metal detector survey, Dennis found slag and clipped iron. And now we're opening up units in this area, and we're finding evidence of, we actually found what we think might be the structure this week. So we're going to be, doing more units in this area. And this, to kind of give you an idea of what this area looks like today, I've got a photosphere here. This is looking up towards the visitor center right here. And then over in this direction, this is headed towards the overseer's house site. So basically, we're going to be working in the middle of a field. And we do have tents that you'll be working under, so you're not going to be under the blaring sunlight, but there are, plenty of insects down here. So you want to bring bug spray. And this is just to give you an idea of where we're at. So we're right near the wood line. No, we haven't found many ticks down here. The other thing is there is poison ivy that we've kept the site isolated from that. But we'll talk more about this. If anybody's allergic to poison ivy, let us know, and we'll just keep you separate from that. But so far this week, we haven't had anybody catch poison ivy except for Chris, who did something really dumb, which is he picked up all the root mat that had been cut and moved it by hand, and now he has poison ivy on his arm. So Chris is, I was like, why'd you do that to yourself, Chris? But what this shot shows is this is all these flags are pulled now, but this is the metal detector survey that Dennis did. The 10-foot grid are these blue flags. I mean, get these lined up. Like this is the 10-foot grid right here. And then all these red flags are where all the hits are. So there's this massive concentration of hits in this area. And then going back to the PowerPoint here, wanted to show you this, this shot right here, you can see, aerial view to the main house, the visitor center, the overseer's house that we excavated last year, blacksmith shop that we just finished, and then the farrier shop is right down in this bottom area right here. So it's a beautiful location. It's isolated from anything, and it gives you kind of a sense of, it's very peaceful down there. It's just a gorgeous space. But for the site, what we're doing now is, we're going for the metal detector survey where, the blacksmith shop, we're finding very similar things there, except at the blacksmith shop site that we just finished, we're finding a lot of evidence for repairs of items. And what we're finding at the farrier shop is more evidence for shoeing of horses. And we'll get into some of that physical evidence when you all are here, next week. And Mary's going to give you an artifact lecture that will cover this. So, but for the units, I mean, this is what the 5x5 units look like that you all are going to be digging in. These are, we'll have you all two per people to a unit with one of the archaeologists supervising you. Going to be doing screening at the site. For the lab, we're going to have the lab out at the site, so you'll be able to do that with Mary at the where the site is, where it was before. But for the site, I mean, you all are going to be working on a site where, this is the second week of excavation. So we're going to be making some really important discoveries that are going to define this site. I mean, a lot of times, you'll work at a site where, there's been the survey and the excavations done, so we know what happened there, and we're just looking to flesh out the details. This is the beginning stages of, this site excavation. And so we're super excited to have you all here, not only for the, let me stop sharing screens here. Goodness, my mouse is going crazy. Where's the mouse? Oh goodness, I've lost it. I've got too much on my desk right here. Here we go. Sorry about this, folks. Let me. Oh, stop share. I'm spazzing out. There we go. There's the stop share screen, stop share button. But that is a auctioneer's rendition of about 200 years of history at Montpelier. So, I'm sure you're brimming with questions, but it's probably getting late as well. But does anybody have any questions? The nice thing about coming to Montpelier for a week is you're going to be doing an in-depth, study of all these, on the landscape. And this is where, like we were talking about first, the power of place is really going to be evident, because not only you're going to be able to experience these sites on the landscape, but then also think about them from different perspectives of, the perspective of a visitor, a perspective of the people that lived and worked at these sites, the perspective of you all being an archaeologist next week, discovering what's at the site, and looking at this landscape in a whole new way in terms of documenting the finds at the site. So anybody have any initial thoughts? Anything different than what you all expected in terms of the sites you'd be excavating? What did you all expect that we'd be looking at with archaeology at Madison's home? Did you all have any ideas or thoughts? Or Olivia, I don't think we've called on you yet. What were you thinking this next week would be like?
Sorry, my Wi-Fi is going in and out. Can you hear me?
I can, Olivia. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know it would actually be this hands-on, so I'm really excited to really get out there. And you said that we would be excavating, and I just think, like, are we gonna actually like find things?
Yeah, that absolutely. That's the kind of programs we run is not where you watch us dig. You're digging and you're learning what the artifacts are. So we'll go over this on Monday. But one of the most important things is to ask lots of questions. And
Okay.
we're going to guide you on how to do the excavations and teach you about all this. But basically, you're part of the research team when you're here next week. And that's something with our programs we're really pride ourselves on to get, it's what we call citizen science. It's a model that was started by Earthwatch where, everyday visitors and the public get involved with the actual science of discovery. And so, yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any thoughts of what you thought you'd be digging versus what you're going to be looking at? Yeah, Emma.
I just thought it was really cool, like the nail slide that you showed, how like the different nails like were from different like parts of history. I thought that was really neat.
That's like the basis of our discovery of all these sites. Without the nails, there would be no way to figure out, first to find the sites with the metal detector surveys, but then also to date them. And then once you date the sites, what time period they're from, then we can create a prioritized list of what sites we do what we're doing, like you're going to be doing next week, which is actually going and excavating them. So the metal detector surveys are an incredibly time efficient way to understand what the sites are, and then prioritize this more intensive process of opening up units. So yeah, it's we're excited about nails too, and they continue to provide discoveries for us. Well, Dr. Thacker and Dr. Bodel, do you all have anything you'd want to add to all this for, preparatory thoughts for next week, or things to get the most out of next week's experience?
I think you've said everything I would want them to hear, Matt, but I
Okay.
will, given the opportunity, of course, I'll say something. Reiterate the importance of asking questions. So all of the archaeology staff that we get to work with, they're so knowledgeable, obviously about the site, but just they're just experts in so many different things, coming with experiences from Montpelier and also elsewhere. And I just encourage you to really, those of you for whom it's out of your comfort zone, to kind of reach out to people you don't know so well and ask them a million questions. Just break out of that comfort zone and ask questions.
And a lot of the folks you'll be working with are their staff interns, meaning they just finished the field school this summer, and now they're continuing on a year-long internship where they're working full-time. And at this point, they've got 3 months of intensive excavation and training under the belt. And a lot of them have experience on other sites they've dug. I mean, for archaeology majors, folks that major in archaeology, which is a subfield of anthropology, throughout their college career, they work at other sites. So you'll, of course, Chris and Terry and Mary and myself have, dozens of years of experience, but you're gonna be able to pretty much get answers to any questions that you all have. So, and I don't know if you all have heard, Emma and Aaron, that Terry's leaving us, which we're really sad. It's a great opportunity for him. He's going to Wake Forest University to become a faculty member there. We'll give you more details. He's going to continue and partner with us, but just really, he told me right before I went on vacation, and it's like, you just wrecked my vacation, Terry. It's super sad. Terry's been here for 7 years, so I'm still.
Will he be there next? He'll be there next week.
He'll be there next week. Yeah, it's his next to last week at Montpelier, which I'm still in shock. I just like, this can't be real. So, but yeah, we got a new colleague that we'll be able to share things with, but it's still going to be a loss.
If I were to add one thing really quickly to what Dr. Thacker has already said, and of course, everything that you've shared today, Matt, I think this is a good opportunity to really say, one of the things that I think happens when you're having an experience like this one at Montpelier is that there are so much new information. Everything is new. It's often quite powerful. And it's hard sometimes to take all those pieces of information, of new information that you're gathering in an experience like this, and start to put them together. And so from time to time, I encourage you to either quietly or in conversation with your classmates, with professors, with the archaeology staff, really work on integrating all of this information, really thinking about putting those pieces together, because when it all starts to sink in, that's, I think, one of those, what I think Matt is really underscoring here is that when you put those pieces together, that power of place really becomes so deep and so layered in extraordinary ways. So I invite you to really take time to try to do that through conversation, as Dr. Thacker suggested, through questions, and then just, through anything that you can to really keep putting those pieces together. Every time I've heard this lecture a few times, and every time I do, I find myself continually putting more layers onto and incorporating more understanding of the complexity of this site. And it's wonderful learning, really powerful learning. And I encourage you to do that work.
And also be prepared next week. For many of you who have never been on a plantation, at Montpelier, we don't present the kind of gone with the wind plantation that you experience at a lot of other sites in the Deep South. This is we present this as the from the human factor, and for a lot of folks, they have found it, really emotionally draining and overwhelming. And so there will be times where, it's a beautiful space, physically, but it is an emotional space, and one it was a site of some horrific events, and we don't shy away from those and put them into the context of larger societal issues that we have today, and it's a lot to take in. And so expect some, there's some emotional drain that'll come from this, and don't feel like that, if you experience that, you're experiencing the, what a lot of people find when they come to Montpelier. Don't feel like that you've been, you're deficient in some way. And that's where some people walk away and they're like, oh I never thought about this. And so, some people have said, I feel like I'm a bad person because I didn't know this, or I didn't recognize the impact. It's something that, it hits all of us like that. It's something that, it's some pretty deep stuff. So anyway, with that somber note, sorry you all. It's but looking forward to seeing you all next, on Sunday, and having a really looking forward to seeing how you all experience all this, and getting to know about archaeology, getting to know each other, and sharing a lot of the thoughts and the history, and especially with the community. Super excited what Dr. Thacker and Bodel have set up with the descendant discussions with the descendant community, and also with the Orange County African American Historical Society, which I'm a board member of, and very excited to have that be part of your week-long experience as well. So, but with that, we've gone over a bit, so I don't want to hold you all up anymore. And but look, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email us. I think I'll make sure that that Sarah Lee put our phone numbers in there if you need to reach us, especially my cell phone number, and Arlington's as well. So, but look forward to seeing you all. I'll see you all at Arlington House at around 5:45. But I know you all are going to meet Sarah Lee at down in the village. I think at Lewis Hall at 3:00. So. All right, well, bye everybody. Good talking with you tonight, okay?
Thanks, Matt.
You.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.
And I'll send the YouTube link to everybody for those that missed this tonight, or for anybody who had a bad connection and wants to watch it again. So, all right.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.